It Chapter 2 was released this past weekend in theaters, and is the continuation of the story that was first adapted into It, that was released in 2017. Pretty much the same cast and crew is back to film this movie as well, with director Andy Muschietti, screenwriter Gary Dauberman, who once again adapted from the original material from Stephen King. Everyone here is back to finish off the story that they began 2 years ago. With that in mind, while Chapter 1 focused on the events that occurred during 1989 with the younger versions of the Losers Club, this film picks up 27 years later when the members of the Losers Club are now all adults and have grown up and tried to move past the trauma of their early years, especially when they encountered Pennywise the dancing clown. When Mike, the only one to have stayed behind in Derry, realizes that It has returned to wreak havoc upon the people of Derry, he calls back all of them to return to Derry and to finish off what they had started in attacking Pennywise and trying to get rid of him once and for all. Now, I was pumped out of my mind to see this movie. It was easily one of my top 10 most anticipated movies of the year. Chapter 1, I felt, was a very successful and contained story that did a lot to move the horror genre forward. I mean, there's a big reason why it ended up becoming the highest grossing horror film of all time. It was satisfying, it had a lot of great humor in it, the suspense was there, and I loved that it was just a nice, fun, and enjoyable character-driven narrative that had creepy elements to it. But as many of us know, that film only focused on half of Stephen King's novel, a gargantuan piece of fiction that is almost 1,200 pages long. Half of it focuses its time on the Losers Club when they were young kids, which is what the first film did, and now this film picks up to the other half of that novel, which follows them as some adults, in which they're trying to deal with that trauma that was left over from their early years, and it all comes back to a head as they're trying to encounter Pennywise. And so that aspect of the story was intriguing to me because the way that people deal with trauma and violent histories in their past is something that I find to be really interesting in stories, whether or not we're talking about movies, video games, books, comic books, whatever. For me, that's a very interesting idea because in this movie, Stephen King not only explored those ideas, but also pioneered a lot of his typical story tropes that you would find in other books of his. And because of those elements, along with the fact that the first film was very successful, there was a lot of hype surrounding this one, and he also had the potential involved with some great actors joining this cast as well, such as Jessica Chastain, James McAvoy, and Bill Hader, coming to portray the adult versions of some of the characters from the original film. There was a lot to look forward to here, and I was very excited to see what Andy Muschietti and crew were able to do in tying the story together. The thing I can definitely say is the best element of this film is that the characters that you knew from the first film are here. They are very much intact. And the story that this movie takes us on, I think, is ultimately satisfying with where it goes. If you were already invested in these characters before, and you enjoyed the journey that Andy Muschietti and crew took us on when these characters were kids, I think that alone should be able to get you into this movie as well, especially since the cast here is incredible. Even if we didn't know who Jessica Chastain, James McAvoy, and Bill Hader were going into this movie, they, along with the other actors who portray the adult versions of the Losers Club, do such an incredible job together. They had great chemistry in pretty much every single scene that they had. And it's also amazing, too, that the casting team behind this movie not only was able to find a lot of actors who closely resembled their youthful counterparts, but also that they were able to just find good, talented actors too, who could bounce off of each other very well. It Chapter 2 does a great job at balancing screen time between all of them and giving each character their individual arcs so that we can get invested in all of them, not just have one single protagonist who stands above the rest, and then have the rest of them just kind of drag along and be support characters for them, I guess. Each one feels important to this narrative, and I appreciate that they never lost the appeal that the first movie had, which was character-driven drama, and the camaraderie that the Losers Club members shared between each other. Of course, that plays heavily into the movie's themes as well, but just for the simple fact that I enjoyed seeing these characters interact as adults too, was very, very effective in at least getting me interested in what was going on, especially in the first act when they meet together in a Japanese restaurant. The dialogue that they all shared together was incredibly fresh with the humor that they all started out with. And then once they switched to a different tone in their conversation, which was much more dramatic, heavy, and full of trauma, it was very seamless for how they were able to go from that conversation to another one with those varying tones. Huge props to Andy Muschietti and the actors for being on point with those scenes And for pretty much everything that they needed to do in this movie, they were able to nail down the emotion and the humor for when they needed to be there. In particular, the standout among these actors has to be Bill Hader as Richie. Even though I enjoyed all these actors, and like I said, they all pretty much have equal screen time, his character probably has the most dynamic arc in the film, especially because in the original movie, Richie didn't really have all that much development to him. For the director to hand over the reins more to him in this story, to have emotional moments and for us to understand more about how his character operates, I think works really well. And Bill Hader does an incredible job with both the humorous side of his character and the darker aspects of his character as well, giving us a more full-fledged person. He gave one of the best performances I've seen all year, at least in terms of supporting actors. And of course, it goes without saying that Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise once again does a phenomenal job here. I never saw the original miniseries with Tim Curry, so I have nothing to really compare him against. But already, this guy has done such an amazing job with his character to the point that I think he superseded Tim Curry as the iconic version of this character. When people think of Pennywise now, they think of him, not Tim Curry, despite the fact that Tim Curry is a magnificent actor. Everything about the way that he moves, he uses his eyes and his voice, is to the level that you would hope an actor would achieve with a role like this, where you don't see them as that actor. They have transformed fully into something else. I can't really fathom how Bill Skarsgård is able to create such an amazing character just almost entirely based on his performance, but he did, and it's also enhanced by how the great cosmetic and visual effects works that's done for him specifically. Above all, if anyone was going to try to fairly critique this movie, I don't think anyone could legitimately find fault with the performances here. They're all great, and they're what truly anchor the movie for me. Overall though, It Chapter 2 pales heavily in comparison to the original for a number of reasons. Of course, to address the elephant in the room, this movie is long. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it there. I mean, it's almost a 3-hour runtime. But that alone isn't really something that would scare me away from a movie, because some of my favorite movies are all very long. 2001: A Space Odyssey, Apocalypse Now, Lawrence of Arabia, Ben-Hur, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. All of these films are pretty much over 3 hours long each. But the thing that makes them effective is there's always something interesting going on. And so the runtimes, even though they are undoubtedly long, they never feel like they drag, because there are things that always keep you invested, whether or not they're the visuals, the scenes that you're watching are integral to the story, and moments don't feel wasted. With It Chapter 2, I can't really say I was ever bored watching this movie because, like I said, I had prior investment in these characters because of how effective the first movie was, but some people have complained about the long runtime, and I don't want to give that superficial comment by saying that it's long and that you have to suffer through this slog of a movie, because it's a simple criticism to just say that a movie's long. Why do we really feel that when we watch movies, even when we might be invested in other scenes? Well, I think for It Chapter 2's specific case, the problem is that the movie treads a lot of the same ground that the first one did. The structure of the movie kind of requires the characters to be put in situations that they already were in the first movie, and because of that, the filmmakers made choices to pretty much have every single character do the same exact series of events that put them through the same exact type of character development as the next one, and they have to go through pretty much the same exact scenario, especially in the second act. The patterns of events that they go through felt extremely repetitive after a while, and it almost felt like old news because we were revisiting some things from the original movie. Sure, I mean, the characters might have been learning things about themselves, but as an audience experience, it wasn't as investing because I was just kind of hoping for something new to be learned about the older versions of the characters. But that's not really the case. It's mostly just informing who they were, again, about who they were when they were young, instead of using that to kind of let us in on their psyche as adults. I get why that choice was made though, because you don't want the adult versions of some characters to be drastically different from who they were when they were kids, because for the audience that might be distracting and take them out of the movie. But at the same time, it does make for very repetitive storylines in that second act. Once I noticed the pattern, I was like, come on, are we really doing this over and over again? Like, do we have to see this in a sequence of events that's already become predictable like the second time I saw it? And in that second act too, I also noticed a lot of technical problems that kind of took me out of the movie as well. They do this thing where, as the adult characters are kind of reliving some of the things from the past, flashbacks to when they were kids are like interspliced into these sequences. With this, the production of this film took place 2 years after the original film did, And so for those young actors who portrayed the younger version of these characters, they're now significantly changed in terms of their physical appearance and how their bodies are shaped. But obviously, if you just took those same actors and filmed those scenes in which they're supposed to take place in the same timeline as the original, they wouldn't necessarily work, because you have these sets of people that look different from what they did before, despite the fact that they're acting in the same time period. So what they had to do is they needed to use de-aging CGI to make them at least have the appearance of what they were in the original movie. But it's strange, because when you see footage of the original movie compared to the new footage that they shot with the de-aging CGI, it is so easy to notice the difference between these two versions of the character. And so I often found myself taken out of the movie just looking at these faces that were obviously not entirely real. In general, though, the effects work in this movie is, for the most part, pretty bad. Despite all the work that went into making Pennywise and all the different versions of him believable, there are so many CGI creations in this movie that felt incredibly fake, and when they're trying to rely on these CGI monsters and just strange creatures in order to drive the horror of this movie, it just doesn't work, because not only was the setup for those sequences very predictable, when certain things would happen or when like a creature would pop out of the shadows, it just wasn't entirely believable and tangible, and you need something tangible in order to make it work in a horror sequence. That's why the scenes with Pennywise himself are so great, because it's just an actor in makeup, only with a slight amount of CGI work in there to obviously allow him to be the full terrifying monster that he is. In fact, the scariest sequences in this movie do involve just this plain, simple version of the character where he's a terrifying clown. I know that the filmmakers had to make that choice to be faithful to the original material, but for the sequences that they're trying to ramp up as scary or suspenseful, it just didn't really work for that purpose, because I wasn't scared by anything I was seeing. Besides that, though, I think this does a decent job at tying loose ends from the original movie, though. The third act of this film is very exciting and fun to watch, and that's simply because these characters are all likable, enjoyable, and you want to see them exceed. Despite all the problems that this movie has in comparison to the first, and how messy and how dragged out some things are, I was invested in these characters from beginning to end. I would be much quicker to watch the original because it is more focused and overall just better made. With that, I am going to be giving it Chapter 2 a C+. For an age recommendation, like the original movie, this earns its R rating for a reason. There is a lot of gory violence in this one, a lot more than the first one actually. There will be some death scenes in this movie that could make some parents uncomfortable because they do involve children. There are otherwise violent moments contained within themselves, like people getting stabbed, dismembered, eaten even, and you will see a lot of blood in this movie. Probably the most fake blood that has been recorded in a single scene also shows up towards the end of the film as well. So be prepared for that if you're a bit squeamish. There's quite a bit of adult language in this movie as well, in addition to some crass humor. There aren't any like sexual scenes or anything of that nature, but you will see a couple of characters that are seen mostly nude without any of the genitalia shown on screen. As a whole, I think at least older teenagers will be able to watch this movie and not really be traumatized by anything that they see, so it's probably best for anyone who's at least 16 years old. Thanks again for watching one of my reviews, guys. I have some more videos planned soon, but in the meantime, if you like this content, please like and subscribe. It really does help me grow my content here. And feel free to check my social media pages out as well to find things there that you won't otherwise find on YouTube. In the end, thank you again for watching, and you have a great one.